Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's been making waves in the world of international relations. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Africa.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's more complex than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, it really is.
We'll be dissecting this using an academic text that really gets into the nitty-gritty.
Right.
And it's pretty eye-opening stuff.
It is, you know?
So before we get lost in the details, can you give us the big picture?
Sure.
What's the main goal of our deep dive today?
Well, we're really trying to understand how Saudi Arabia's role in Africa has changed over time.
Okay.
What their motivations have been, how those interests have evolved.
Yeah.
And then we want to see how that plays out in today's world, especially around the Red Sea.
The Red Sea.
Yeah, that's become a real focal point, geopolitically speaking.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now.
Good. Yeah.
So where does this story begin?
Well, according to our source, it all goes back to King Faysal in the 1960s and 70s.
Okay.
He's really the key figure here.
All right. So after the Six-Day War in 1967, he saw a chance to push back against Israel's growing influence.
Interesting.
And he decided to do that by building relationships with African nations.
So from the very beginning, it was a strategic move.
Oh, absolutely.
But was it just about countering Israel, or were there other things at play?
Well, at that point, it was mainly a reaction to what was happening in the Middle East.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia wanted to strengthen its position on the world stage, right? It wasn't so much about having this, grand vision for Africa.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was more about establishing those initial diplomatic connections.
So it sounds like they were reacting to events instead of really setting the agenda.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so they're playing a bit of catch-up. Now, what happened after King Faysal?
Well,
Did his successors keep that momentum going?
engagement with Africa actually faded after he died.
Really?
Yeah, but they didn't completely disappear.
They kept some interests going, especially in the Horn of Africa.
Why the Horn of Africa?
Well, think about the geography.
Okay.
It's right across the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, right.
It's super important strategically,
Makes sense.
both for security and for controlling those shipping routes.
Yeah, you can't just ignore a powerful neighbor right across the street.
Exactly, exactly.
So what were they doing there, specifically?
Well, Somalia is a good example.
Okay.
During the Cold War, they supported the U.S. in trying to limit Soviet influence. And later, they even tried to be peacemakers between the different groups fighting in Somalia.
Trying to maintain that balance.
It was a delicate situation, that's for sure.
So it seems like they were dipping their toes in, but not really diving in headfirst.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So we've got this period of limited engagement, mostly focused on their immediate neighborhood, the Horn of Africa.
Right.
What was the turning point that brought Saudi Arabia back to Africa in a bigger way?
Well, there are a few factors, but one big one was the global food crisis in 2007.
Oh, yeah, those are scary times.
It really shook things up.
I remember.
Food prices went through the roof, and it had a huge impact on everyone.
Yeah, going to the grocery store suddenly became a lot more stressful.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
And it seems like that was a wake-up call for Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, they realized they needed to diversify where they were getting their food from. They were too reliant on imports.
Risky.
Very.
So they turned to Africa.
They did.
And started investing in agriculture.
Big time.
Where were they putting their money?
All over, really.
Wow.
Sudan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda.
Okay.
You've got South Africa, Senegal, Mali, Kenya, Niger, and the list goes on.
It sounds like they meant business.
They did.
But was this all just about securing their own food supply?
It seems that way.
A pretty practical, maybe even self-serving approach.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay, so food security brings them back into the game. But there's another factor that always seems to come up when we talk about Saudi Arabia's influence: Wahhabism.
Right.
How does that fit into this narrative?
It's a complicated issue.
Yeah.
But our source emphasizes that for a long time, spreading Wahhabism wasn't really a central part of their policy in Africa.
Really? That's not the impression I always get.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you always hear about this link between Saudi Arabia and the spread of Wahhabism.
Yeah, the connection is there, but it's not as straightforward as some people think.
Okay.
They definitely invested in education and religious training in some African countries, but to say that this is what caused local jihadist movements is a huge oversimplification.
Right.
There's so many other factors.
I see. So it's not a direct line from Saudi investment to extremist groups.
Exactly. It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, we got to be careful not to jump to conclusions.
Agreed.
Okay, so we have this period of limited engagement driven by strategic interests and then food security. When does their interest in Africa really take off?
Well, the Arab uprisings in 2011 are a major turning point.
The Arab Spring.
Yeah.
That was a time of huge change.
It was. And for Saudi Arabia, one of the big concerns was the perceived threat from Iran. They saw Iran trying to increase its influence in Africa.
Okay.
And that really set off alarm bells.
So this renewed interest, it wasn't really about engaging with Africa for its own sake.
Not really, no.
It was more about countering Iran.
Yeah, it was a security-driven policy.
What did they actually do to counter Iran?
Well, there was actually a bit of a delay between their concerns and their actions.
Really?
Yeah, there were reports that their embassies in Africa were understaffed.
Interesting.
And they were struggling to compete, not just with Iran, but also with China.
So, a tough situation.
Definitely.
So when did things really start to change?
2015 was a pivotal year.
Okay.
First, you have Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, becoming crown prince.
Yeah, a major player.
For sure.
And then, of course, the war in Yemen begins.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting in terms of Africa.
Oh, I can't wait to hear about this.
Well,
Let's dive in. All right, lay it on me. How did the Yemen war change things?
well, the war in Yemen, it became like this proxy war with Iran.
Uh-huh.
Saudi Arabia saw the Houthi rebels as Iranian puppets, basically.
Okay.
So the stakes were super high for them.
Yeah.
And that's when the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea become even more important, strategically speaking.
Yeah, you don't even need to look at a map to see why, right? The Horn of Africa is right there.
Right there across the water.
Just a hop, skip, and a jump from Yemen.
Exactly. And that's where the UAE comes in. They're Saudi Arabia's main ally in the Gulf and a big player in the Yemen war, too.
Okay.
But the UAE also has its own ambitions in Africa.
What kind of ambitions?
Oh, they've got economic interests all over the continent.
So are we seeing a Saudi-UAE tag team forming in Africa?
You could say that.
What does that look like in practice?
Imagine this. You're standing on the coast of the Red Sea.
Okay.
To your left, there's a UAE military base in Eritrea.
Wow.
To your right, another one in Somaliland.
And what about Saudi Arabia?
They're reportedly looking at Djibouti for their own base.
So it's a real power play right on the water.
It is, with huge implications for trade and security in the region.
It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
A little bit.
Is this Red Sea strategy still mainly about keeping Iran in check?
That's definitely a big part of it.
Okay.
They've been trying to weaken Iran's ties with countries like Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, the whole game.
And how successful have they been?
Well, they've had some wins, for sure.
Okay.
Many of those countries have scaled back their relationships with Iran.
So that makes it harder for Iran to operate in the Red Sea.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like this new chessboard for influence with Saudi Arabia and the UAE trying to outmaneuver Iran.
It is, but it's not quite that simple.
What do you mean?
Remember how we talked about Saudi Arabia's tendency to be reactive in Africa?
Yeah, always reacting to what's happening in the Middle East.
Right. Well, that hasn't totally gone away.
So even though they're more involved in Africa now...
They're still making some missteps.
Oh, this is where it gets interesting.
It is.
Tell me more. What kind of missteps?
There's been some tension lately between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side, and countries like Djibouti, Sudan, and Somalia on the other.
Okay.
For example, Djibouti's getting pretty fed up with what they see as Saudi Arabia and the UAE bossing them around.
So those alliances are a little shaky?
They're not as solid as they might seem from the outside.
It's not just a simple us versus them situation.
Nope, it's much more complicated than that.
And I bet those cracks are creating opportunities for other countries.
You got it. Like who?
Well, look at Turkey, for example.
Okay.
They've been stepping up their game in the Horn of Africa,
Really?
taking advantage of that tension we just talked about.
How so?
They're offering development aid and military cooperation, positioning themselves as a more reliable partner. Wow, so it's not just a three-way power struggle anymore.
It's getting crowded.
So it's a real scramble for Africa.
It is, and the situation is changing all the time.
Yeah?
It's like a game of chess where the rules keep changing mid-game.
And you never know who's going to make the next move.
Exactly. There are no clear winners or losers at this point.
With all these different interests clashing, what does it mean for Saudi Arabia's future in Africa?
That's the million-dollar question.
Can they break out of this reactive mode
It's hard to say.
and really establish themselves as a major player?
Well, the Yemen war is going to be a big factor.
Makes sense.
If they can achieve their goals there, it'll give them more leverage in the Horn of Africa.
Okay.
But it's not just about Yemen, though.
Right, there's that bigger picture.
the whole regional power dynamic is in flux. You've got the Saudi-UAE relationship, the rise of Turkey, China's growing influence.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is, and all of that is going to shape what happens next.
It seems like Saudi Arabia is in a tough spot. They want to be seen as a leader, but they risk pushing away potential allies with their tactics.
It's a delicate balancing act.
How do they find that balance?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
They need to figure out how to engage with African nations as partners.
Exactly.
Not just pieces on a chessboard.
Right, and that means taking a more nuanced approach.
One that actually considers what African countries need and want.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
And this brings up a really important point.
What's that?
We've been focusing on the big players, the outside powers. But what about the African nations themselves?
A good question.
How are they dealing with all this attention from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, everyone?
Well, it's a mixed bag.
How so?
Some leaders welcome the investment and aid that comes with these partnerships.
Okay.
But others are worried about becoming too dependent on any one country.
They don't want to be caught in the middle.
Exactly. They're trying to find a way to benefit from these relationships without giving up their own independence.
It's like walking a tightrope.
It is. They're trying to leverage these connections to their advantage, but also protect their own interests.
It's a tough balancing act.
No doubt about it.
So instead of these clear-cut sides,
Yeah.
we're seeing a much more fluid and dynamic situation.
Right, with African nations forging their own path.
Exactly.
And that makes it even harder to predict what's going to happen.